So our conference today began on a very positive note with Julia telling us about conservation optimism and Jim helping with some song singing. So it's my challenge to try and leave you after such a successful day with some sort of well-being feeling. So welcome to a celebration of life, which is the EU's programme for supporting environmental and nature conservation projects. I'd like to emphasise that I'm very much the front person here. I'm grateful to my colleagues Peter Jones, Carl Fielding, Colette Price, Christine Edwards, Julie Creer for putting together this presentation. But actually, I'm at the front of a much larger Team NRW army. And equally, I'd like to think some of the remarks I'm about to make will have resonance with many of the stakeholders in this room, and indeed our general biodiversity community in Wales, because the work that we have achieved with the LIFE programme over the past few decades would not have been possible without all of us working together. And Welsh Government are a very important component in that, in terms of giving us direction and particularly in terms of funding. So the objectives of my talk are to celebrate achievement. We may not end with singing, but we might end with some flag waving, I hope. I will give you a very snapshot overview of the history of the LIFE programme. We will illustrate that with a whole series of case studies across different habitats. And that'll be by no means exhaustive. We have to dip in where we can. And we will conclude by looking at some of the most recent projects and a look to the future. So, in 1973, the UK, alongside Denmark and Ireland, joined what was then called the European Economic Community. And the debate about the benefits of being a member economically continues to this day. The 1980s were quite an interesting time to be around in the environmental world. There was a growing appreciation of large-scale pressures, and the EU could see a focus in their activities around this. So, for example, we had the Chernobyl catastrophe in 1986, which led to over 2 decades of restrictions on Welsh farms in particular. We learnt about the growing phenomenon of global warming, and indeed the hole in the ozone. So EU was beginning to put out its tentacles into the world, beginning to realise it was a potential to be a global player in some of these issues, and it began to appreciate the importance of having funding for habitat restoration in particular. So LIFE funding began in 1992, and when I talk about LIFE funding, that is the overarching umbrella project. LIFE Nature is within that, but LIFE funding can also cover things like climate change, transport, waste. So a much bigger picture that is focused on things like environmental policy and climate change policy at a European level. There have been 4 phases of LIFE, and they have co-financed almost 4,000 projects now, and underpinned by a very large amount of money, 301 billion euros. Now we're looking in this particular slide at LIFE Nature funding. And in its current phase, which runs until 2020, there is 630 million euros available. Again, this is an incentive for further investment from other organisations and indeed governments. It's an ambitious programme seeking to restore or improve over 6% of the terrestrial Natura 2000 network alone. Of the 50,000 actions being implemented, that amounts to over 200,000 hectares of land being bought and over 50,000 or 95,000 training sessions for the community involved in nature conservation in Europe. Communication and engagement with people, local communities, is a critical part of all LIFE Nature projects. An evaluation of the LIFE Nature programme was carried out in 2017, and it confirmed its importance in a number of fields. LIFE Nature helps to make the application of EU environmental and climate legislation and policies consistent across the EU. It allows better sharing of responsibilities and promotes solidarity around our EU shared environmental assets. And it promotes exchange of best practice and knowledge. So all those good European Union principles that we have come to know and love over the last few decades. So again, focusing down a little further, we're now looking at what Life Nature has done in Wales. So since 1996, over 30 LIFE projects were active in Wales. Again, all this was made possible with underpinning funding from the Welsh Government. And then there was a contribution of over 50 million euros from the EU. And some of those projects would have been specific to Wales, and then some of them, only part of them, would have been carried out in Wales. Sometimes the majority, sometimes maybe a minor component of it. So Life Nature, as I was saying, focuses on nature particularly, but this is part of the overarching LIFE programme. And there were a wide range of beneficiaries for these resources. So local authorities, businesses, universities, environmental NGOs, agencies like Environment Agency, as was, or CCW and Forest Research, and of course, most recently, Natural Resources Wales. So this is very much a community asset and a community resource. Since 2000, LIFE funding for nature specifically amounted to over 30 million euros. And that, of course, has drawn in further partnership funding. All of this being spent on the natural environment. NRW were project leaders for 4, and 5 were led by other partners. So what's so special about being part of a LIFE project? Well, I think they are very special, really. They enable us to resolve issues at a level and with a focus that we can rarely really never normally achieve. They are absolutely great for organisations and people. People are very proud to be part of these projects. They offer hope and vision for organisations and communities. Again, the EU have a very strong focus on comms, communications, very integral part of the project. All of them are evidence-based or science-based and come with a very strong monitoring component. They are a real marker of excellence. LIFE is highly competitive, tightly monitored. They encourage very high-quality projects with exemplar standards of conservation practice. It's very nice to feel part of something bigger. So we are part of the European community and the European environment through participating in LIFE. It encourages transnational cooperation. You make contact with others. You share information. And LIFE projects have a very strong commitment to sustaining their project outcomes into the future. Genuine progress with after-LIFE actions is always a challenge. And the prospect of funding cliffs does always loom large. So my first involvement in the LIFE project was with this particular one back in, well, it started off in the late 90s. And at that stage, the Habitats Directive was something we were just about getting used to. And we were trying to learn about some of the habitats and species that were occurring in Wales. So, you know, in any scientific world, the first thing you do is an ecological review. So we were looking at the ecology of things like Atlantic salmon, Alison Thwaite shad, bullhead, river and brook lamprey, floating water plantain, and ranunculus river habitat. And there were 4 main outputs from this project: the ecological reviews. Then the next step was to suggest some survey methodologies linked with those habitats and species, and develop the monitoring protocols for assessing the condition of the sites. In the course of that, we began to realise there were specific issues coming out in terms of pressures for our Welsh rivers, things like the low fecundity of freshwater pearl mussel populations, nutrient input, siltation, the impact of forestry. So there were some special issues around developing techniques that might be applied there. And finally, we produced 7 SAC river conservation strategies. And further management planning for the environment were built on these pioneering strategies. More recently, for river habitats, we've been part of the Pearls in Pearl project, not surprisingly focusing on freshwater pearl mussel and being led by S&H, because that's the core concentration of pearl mussels in the UK. And the objective of the project was to restore their habitat, secure the long-term survival, and again, communicate. Activities were carried out on the Avon Eden. We tried to improve the catchment management, especially in relation to forestry, carried out in-stream habitat restoration, looked at nutrient input and sediment input, and indeed monitoring. Mow the Mussel was released into the Twitter sphere, and it was recognised by the European Commission as a great public relations tool. We're now moving on to peatland ecosystems, and this active blanket bog in Wales project was led by the RSPB. I think the numbers under the key outcomes sort of stand up for themselves and hopefully will be available as a reference after the conference in the form of these slides. But there was quite a lot of activity in terms of blocking drainage ditches, removing conifers and non-native species, installing fire breaks. Again, communication right across the community from landowners to local school children with the required monitoring programme. This really was a game changer. It was one of the first large-scale conservation projects to get off the ground in Wales. I think it helped enormously in terms of changing attitudes to drainage blocking within the farming community, and it was the first large-scale hydrological restoration programme for the Welsh uplands, paving the way for many other projects led by Snowdonia National Park, the National Trust, Glastier and NRW. Again, all supported by Welsh Government. And this is just giving you an example of the scale that we're talking about here. There's an aerial photograph of the Mignite, which was part of that project. And you might be able to spot the 3 large excavators filling in drains in this picture. Again, we're moving on to another type of habitat, this time in the lowlands, the Anglesey and Clean Fens project. And the headline around that was the amount of fen brought into recovering or in favourable condition. Again, substantial amount of money, over 5.4 million euros, and this time with contribution from Welsh Water. So in this case, we were trying to safeguard rich fen habitat, provide access for grazing, carrying out some quite sensitive habitat management in terms of hand mowing and grazing, buying land as well, and trying to tackle particular pressures like nutrient input. One of the really nice elements of this project, I think, was the focus on constructed treatments for wetlands, constructed wetlands. They were trying to intercept nutrients, and they were monitored as part of that. And we also linked up and produced 2 PhD projects in the course of this work. So again, there's a chance to link up with the academic community here. And one of the project's staff, Roswin Leonard, has gone on to do a PhD and is now working as one of our New Life for Welsh Raised Bog project officers. And I think she's probably here in the audience. So now we're moving on to projects that are currently active. Here we have the Marches, Mosses and Bog Life project. It's our second chance to fix some of the issues for these sites and to step up our restoration activities generally by restoring over 600 hectares of bog and lag habitat. Again, you can see some common elements coming out here in terms of trying to manage or remove conifer plantations, trying to improve hydrology for these wetland sites. In this case, we have the additional challenge with dealing with contaminated land, and we are trying to also restore and acquire additional areas to add to the site. Again, lots of public engagement, lots of opportunities for volunteers to take part. So this is naturally led in association with NRW and the Shropshire Wildlife Trust. And one of our latest projects is, of course, the New Life for Raised Bogs project. I love the name of this. Have a think about it. Welsh Raised Bogs. It's very clever. And coming from Central Ireland, I think that's what we need more of, is Welsh raised bogs. In this particular case, we are aiming to restore all 7 raised bog SACs in Wales, again facilitated by a very generous European contribution in terms of money. We're trying to stabilise water levels across the sites and tackle particular issues like scrub encroachment. Again, community involvement. So watch this place. The project officers are here. You can come talk to them. You can get involved and follow us on Twitter. Even more recently, we had the pleasure of launching the Sands of Life project. So again, moving on to another habitat. And this will focus on some of our large-scale sand dune systems in North and South Wales mostly. Again, we are focusing on the features mentioned in the Habitats Directive. So we've got 5 Annex 1 habitats in this project and 3 Annex 2 species which occur in sand dunes. A really important element of this is the restoration of geomorphological processes. So moving on again from the challenge for hydrology in the wetlands, and again the removal of native and non-native species. And some of you would have noticed at the end of August that there was press coverage for the Celtic Rainforest project, and this is led by Snowdonia National Park. And again, there's a focus on invasive species and in grazing. But one of the really attractive elements of this project, from my point of view, is the focus on culture and heritage. So our Celtic oak rainforests are actually part of a remnant forest which extended from Portugal to Scotland. And they were really the backdrop or the landscapes and settings for many of our Celtic legends and folk tales, including the Mabinogion. So that's a really nice sort of cultural service, I guess, that might be delivered through this project. So, looking to the future, I have to say a few words about the N2K project, because that was very much part of trying to secure our legacy for our SAC sites in Wales. And the Life Nature 2000 programme for Wales was led by NRW, and working with specialists and other stakeholders, the project determined the key challenges facing Natura 2000 and identify the actions that needed to be addressed. So this wasn't really about carrying out action on the ground. It was about using this prioritised action framework planning tool that the European Union requires us to use, so we can plan for our sites for the future and for what management activities will need to be funded. So that's a very powerful resource to have, that prioritised action framework. But the project also delivered some management and restoration plans for the network. There are reports on evidence gaps, ecosystem services, nitrogen action planning, and potential new approaches to management. All these are available on NRW's website. We produced PIPs and TAPs, prioritised improvement plans, seek to further understand the challenges facing our Natura 2000 sites in Wales, and thematic action plans detail priority strategic actions to address the major issues and risks which have been identified as having an inverse impact on our Natura 2000 sites. If you're interested in seeing or having access to any of these reports, please talk to Christine Edwards, who is here with us today. So, at the moment, the UK is on course to leave the European Union in 2019. And in a statement issued by DEFRA recently, they agreed to honour any life funding which may be lost as a result of a no-deal Brexit. Under a negotiated scenario, it's hoped UK organisations will be able to participate in the LIFE programme until 2020, its current phase. And any projects agreed within this period will be fully funded by the Commission. So, to conclude, I'd like to thank all my NRW colleagues again, and all our partners and Welsh Government. I'm very proud of the people I've worked alongside with in NRW, especially last summer, when we set aside other areas of work to try and develop some of these new projects, because we thought it might be one of our few or last opportunities to secure this sort of resource for the Welsh environment. But we should all be collectively proud of the achievements delivered under LIFE in Wales over the past few decades. All those involved have shown leadership and vision in environmental management for our country. Together, we have helped make Wales, as they sing at the last night of the proms, a green, sometimes a little bit browner, but definitely a more pleasant land. So please wave your flags and celebrate EU life. Thank you very much.